Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Inspiring Honesty. I'm your host, Greg Brahe, and I'm an atheist. Be joined again by the unconventional pastor, Bob Greaves, my incredible co-host, and today we're going to go back, I think, to a more theological or philosophical question. The last couple of weeks we focused on my skeptic roots and science, and I love doing that, but a little bit motivated to talk a little bit on the other end of the spectrum today. And I had two potential topics. I was introducing them a bit to Bob before the show, but ran out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and continue that here. The first topic that I would love to discuss, I don't know how much we're going to be able to get out of it, because I think you and I will agree with it quite a bit, is I was on Reddit the other day, and somebody had posted something saying that they were experiencing doubts because of unanswered prayers. And they've been praying about serious issues that they really feel they need help with. For specifically intercessory prayers. Now, somebody responded, well, God answers prayers with yes, no, and not yet. So just because they haven't been answered yet, or sometimes even if it was answered no, doesn't mean that that's not an answered prayer. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. My toaster answers prayers with yes, no, and not yet. In a retrospective, we can apply that to absolutely any possible outcome. The only way in which a yes, no, or not yet triplicate of answers, or a trichotomy, is that the word I'm looking for, would be if the answer was explicitly given to you in saying that
Yeah.
given something that said no or not yet. So you knew what the answer was instead of determining it based on the outcome and then retrospectively going back in there. And then this is what got me. I mean, I figured you and I would agree on that to some extent, at least. But this continued a little bit. And that's what I thought was interesting was then the person responded, well, you're assuming that this is a science experiment that people are asking for these things. The purpose of prayer is not to test the existence of God. It is to help develop a relationship with God. To which I responded, that may be the purpose of some prayers, but this is specifically an intercessory prayer asking God to do something. So obviously that's not the goal of this isn't meditation or just a chat. This is a request. And then they kind of hit me with one that I guess this is the reason I wanted to talk with you more, is they said that I'm trying to pull up the actual quote here because it was pretty well worded. And I said that I think that it is far more reasonable to simply say that since a toaster can make the same response, then your no and not yet are only relevant answers if they're explicitly given. Otherwise, you're just explaining it away. And that's what the original poster had said, was that I feel like they're explaining things away. And I absolutely agree with that. And it's much easier in my mind, and it makes much more sense to treat the situations, even if they are not intended to be experimental, as an experiment. It's a natural experiment in that sense. And to say, well, what are the possible situations here? It's possible that there is a God that heard you and didn't answer. It's possible that the God answered and you weren't listening. Or it's possible that there is no God, or that the God didn't hear you. There's plenty of other possible solutions. And the response that I got, it's a little bit along the precept line, but it was that, we're Christians, and assuming, or we believe, we have faith that there is a God, that it is a loving God that is omniscient and therefore hears our prayers. So I said your argument basically boils down to the idea that not answering somebody, just refusing to even listen to them or ignoring them, is the same as giving them an answer. And they said, well, yes, if there is a God and it is listening to everything that we say and to these prayers, and it doesn't answer, then that is an answer of a sort, similar to a parent just ignoring your child asking for a cookie. I had to say that was that sort of put me back a bit. I didn't know exactly how to respond to that. So, I mean, in that case, it doesn't necessarily matter to the original poster's point that it still isn't satisfying as an answer, but it's actually true. And that I think brought upon some other implications that bring up sort of the nature of God. This might be a better topic for Clash Course, but it played along with the idea that we were talking, the Epicurus quote with saying, if God is able to prevent suffering, but not willing, then he's malevolent. And all I could think is if it's true that there is a God that hears every prayer, then the God who willfully ignores the prayer of a starving child for food, or of a child being savagely beaten to stop this act from happening, that is a terrible, terrible God. There's a quote.
I don't agree with that, but I realize that's a very common argument. I don't agree with it because, to me, what would you think if Casey becomes a teenager and he starts breaking neighbors' windows with rocks, and you have the ability to replace these windows, and there comes a point in time when you have to make Casey take responsibility for the things that he's doing.
That's why I brought up children, though,
right?
Because you're certainly, that's a relevant case to be made for adults, but I'm talking about I hate to bring up the
let me ask you this:
but they're relevant.
Are you able to do anything about it?
Am I able? Well, not directly. No, I've not been in the situation where I've been able to stop. Well, that's not true. I have been in the situation where I've been able to stop individual acts from happening, and I have intervened in those situations.
Excellent. So. Yeah. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of people who don't, and I don't think there's a single child. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think that it's extremely rare on planet Earth that there is a child suffering somewhere where there isn't an adult who has the responsibility to intervene. And a great deal of the suffering that we go through is when I say self-inflicted, I mean the human race. It's suffering we inflict on ourselves. Well, we need to stop doing that. And if we have somebody who has this ability to intervene on our behalf, all that's going to do is just indulge us and make us realize, oh, I can do anything I want to, and if it's going to be really bad for somebody, God will intervene.
I think, though, that's a bit of a harsh way of looking at it. I mean, it might be accurate. I'm not going to say that it's not, but I mean to bring up some of the extremes, though, like it was within the last month, there was an 8-year-old girl who was raped to death by her husband in an Islamic country. She was married off because child marriages are common there, and literally raped until she died. How is that something that a loving God should not have stopped? I mean, I don't care. I'm not saying that he should have stopped it from, ever happening in any way, like the marriage or anything, completely eliminated the situation. But the moment that this husband had the intention of doing this to his child bride, a loving God could have simply destroyed him. He evaporated that man off of the planet. And it certainly would have still taught the lesson to the human race.
Would it? How would we know? If people just
when people start evaporating when they're about to do acts of evil, I think that's a pretty strong lesson to stop doing evil.
I don't. I think if you stop doing evil because you're going to get cooked, then you'd have no morals at all. I don't see fear. I mean, to me, it's like, let's take this to its logical conclusion. When do we draw the line? When does it stop? And the truth is this. Let's pretend, just for the sake of argument, there is no God. Let's just pretend that for the sake of argument. How's this evil ever going to end? Ever. It's only going to end when human beings make other human beings take responsibility for what they're doing. And that's what they need to do. And they don't. And you know what? I actually think, to be honest with you, that many times it's Christians who maintain this evil going on, because we talk about a God who's in control. And then there's honest atheists like you are saying, well, some control, And the truth is, we just sit around lethargically on our asses as if this world is just going to somehow, culminate in awesomeness and God knows what he's doing. I'm sorry. We have no proof that we're not entirely on our own. When do we start acting like it? When do we start acting like it?
Hey, you're talking like an atheist, and I
that's
agree
right.
there.
That's right. That's right. And I believe, so although I believe in a personal God, I don't believe he's personal in that way. And I think that if he were, we would never learn those lessons, ever. We would become spoiled little children doing whatever the hell we want, and all the evil, horrid evil that could grow out of some of our most indulgent, irresponsible behavior would just simply be, sorry, playing Nintendo or something,
But that also, yes, I agree that there's not a way for us to naturally and organically learn these things without going through them. I mean, Joey made the point in Clash Course that humans have come to understand to a far greater degree the evils of homicide and of chemical warfare and things by doing them and being shocked at what it feels like. I think I've brought it up in the show before, but there's a short story, I think, it might even be a full novel, that talks about a future in which warfare it becomes completely decided by computer simulation. Sort of, it's just two countries both create their champions in a computer, and they battle the computers against each other. And then whatever one ends, or whatever one loses in the end, that country willingly sacrifices a predetermined amount of its own people. Which it's just
wasn't that 1984? Aldous Huxley, wasn't that 1984? Didn't that a similar scenario occur in 1984?
Yeah, well, 1984 was Bradbury. No, that was Fahrenheit 451. Orwell.
Yeah.
Right. I forget.
Yeah, right.
Because Huxley was.
I got that mistaken. But the point is that a similar theme occurs in there, where through the newspeak, people are just made to believe that these things are going on. So that they can have their nationalism triggered and stuff like that. Now, in a sense, from a theistic standpoint, there is a great amount of evil going on in this brief 70 to 100 years that we might be alive. Great amount of evil going on. But now, certainly not traditional theists who think that, and a lot of you are going to die and go to hell. But, if there is this ongoing lesson to be learned, there's a sense in which in light of eternity, this is a little more than a timeout.
Well, that's true, but I think it depends on the scale of which you are considering God to be personal and loving. That
right.
Those who consider themselves to have a personal, loving relationship with God, as in that God cares deeply about them as an individual, as if they are his own child, that is a sincere problem with this theology.
It's a metaphor.
Because using
it's a metaphor. It's kind of like you know what I'm talking.
Well, you view it as a metaphor, but
I do.
I don't think that other people do. I mean, that's the part that's.
Well, that's because they're irresponsible, lazy, and dishonest. Because
Bob, you have to understand,
honest,
though, this isn't Clash Course. This is
right.
where you and I, a theist and an atheist,
right.
can come together to discuss why these beliefs can be really bad and really harmful, and why people shouldn't think like that. So, I'm depending on you to help.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned about intercessory prayer. And the words we get from the Bible in intercessory prayer have been traditionally translated to convey this concept of intercession. And we understand intercession to be standing in the gap between bad things and the solution. That's what intercession is. It's like going to bat for you. But the truth is, that's just some of the ways that word was used. The truth is that word was also used in ways that were the opposite of hamartia, which is a word which really means, it's a word which, in its most literal sense, you shoot the arrow at a target, and if you miss the bullseye, That's hamartia. It's missing the mark. Well, the word for intercession was a word that could be used for hitting the mark, and there's a sense in which, as I understand it, if I talk to God, about all I'm doing is getting it off my chest, and that moment of discussion and talking helps me to kind of understand more clearly, having taken the time to stop and think and reflect and chat about it into the air, as it were, to discover what it's going to take to actually hit the mark. And I think that if I, for example, if I'm aware of something that I haven't done in a while, but I used to even quite regularly give to this leprosy foundation, where they could cure leprosy for just $150. They cure it with the medicine. In praying for these people, that's my opportunity. I can see what can be done, and in doing it, hey, there you go. So my thinking about it makes me aware of the problem, and to realize where I might fit in the solution. And I do, of course, this is me. There's very few theists take this position. I think that God holds us more responsible and believes in our ability far more than we do. We're creating this mess. We need to solve it, and we need to start working with it as if it's our problem and our responsibility to solve it. But I'll ask you this. You look at the world. Most kids who are suffering in places, it's because I think it's because of religion in many cases, because of the way the religion blinds them. And I think it's because of the fact that not only does the religion blind people, but it is also something that causes them to sit back and go, well, God's going to take care of it, so I don't need to do anything. And what do? We sit on our butts all day and let all this evil continue. How long has mankind been around, civil enough to understand these aren't good things?
Well, that's what's the quote exactly? I think it's a single pair of hands working is more useful than 1,000 clasped in prayer. It's a paraphrase. It's not exactly accurate, but I mean, I absolutely agree that, of course, that is to me because hands clasped in prayer are not accomplishing anything. But
well, I would say
have
not
to,
accomplishing anything. It is necessary if we're going to meet some real serious problems to at least take a moment, think about them, talk about them.
well, yes, and you're right.
Yeah.
I mean,
but
from a
it's just a
personal
part. It's
psychological
just the
perspective,
gearing up, right? It's a part of the gearing up process, and but nothing more. This concept that somehow we're going to ask God to do things and God is going to do them with a mighty hand is just damn irresponsible. The way I see it, we suffer on this planet. This may be a harsh thing to say. We suffer on this planet exactly to the degree that we tolerate suffering.
I have to disagree on that one. And actually, we have a viewer comment that is related to that. That we suffer at our own hands to the degree that we tolerate it. But there's still plenty of other suffering that exists that is entirely without human cause. I mean, natural disasters, disease, and I mean, natural diseases like cancers and, the old age even.
Well, now we're talking about GMOs again. No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, here comes it. Well, that's the chemtrails, but
yeah, right.
Fluoridation in the water supply. Speaking of which,
if you've ever stopped to think about it, a lot of people have observed the caterpillar and the cocoon, and then watching the butterfly struggle to get out of that cocoon. And you know what happens if you help the butterfly get out of the cocoon?
You eat it. I'm not sure what's
no. If you help the butterfly get out of the cocoon, it'll never fly, because it's the struggle it goes through in coming out of the cocoon that actually squeezes certain things out into its wings. That makes it.
You've said that before. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm gonna look it up because that seems like the kind of thing that is brought up, as like a powerful metaphor and is just kind of made up.
Well, it could be. It could be. And maybe that's where I've even heard it. But I guess what I'm saying is that Nobody likes to suffer, and nobody would like to think that suffering is necessary. But I'll tell you one thing that is absolutely psychologically true. If it weren't for suffering, people wouldn't learn anything.
Well,
Makes me
I mean,
wonder,
that's
what do we need to learn?
I think that there's certain things that people wouldn't learn, particularly ethically speaking. You're right. I mean, ethics in general, I would argue, is um, the compassion and the empathy that, or it stems from the compassion and empathy that relate to having experienced suffering on our own and to seeing that suffering occur in other people and being able to,
Right.
therefore, help or want to avoid it and be compelled to
Yeah.
do so. But I,
Now,
I
I wouldn't
guess
want to. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Uh,
what I'm talking about here is not, and Joey and I are debating the suffering thing specifically as it goes. Mine is specifically talking about the intentional and willful ignoring of, and regardless of the etymological or historical background of the word intercessory, but intercessory prayers meaning prayers where people are asking God to help them at this moment because they are in dire need. And I'm going to limit this even to situations where there's no chance that they are going to learn from it because they're going to die if this happens. People who have terminal illnesses and people who have
okay. What makes you think
there
they're not going
are
to learn from it just because they die? That's an assumption. Now,
that's
let me.
philosophical. I mean,
It
there's
is.
certainly more
Yeah.
that goes into that.
The,
There's a
well,
great
the
short
truth
story
is,
called An Egg.
now I certainly don't want to defend that as the answer. It isn't. I'm just saying the truth is we're now talking about something. When we're talking about what's on the other side of death, we're talking about something we don't know anything about. So we don't know if that's a useless death or a meaningful death. We don't know. We really don't. And I don't know that we can assert
But
that
I
it is
think that
meaningful.
the concept of parsimony or Occam's razor leads us to the conclusion that we also don't know what before life was like for us. But
No.
as far as we're aware, it was non-existence. And uh, the most parsimonious conclusion, meaning the one that requires the fewest assumptions, is the one that is non-existence is what follows death, and that's where I come from
Of
as an
course,
atheist.
right? Yeah, but is Occam's razor always correct, or just more often than not?
Occam's razor is, when drawing a conclusion with incomplete information, that is a principle that should be followed. But obviously, that's not a principle that needs to always be followed because sometimes we
Right.
have complete information. And you're right that sometimes
But
the more complete
it's
information doesn't prove that
basically Occam's
it's
razor,
wrong.
as I understand it, is a is an honest assessment of where the odds are best to bet. But it is not a statement that says, and that will be the best. That'll be the real answer. It's just that it's the safest.
Well,
It is
I'm
the
going to argue that
it,
it's beyond that level of saying it's the safest. I'll agree that
oh,
that
really?
is the
Yeah.
case, but it's also the most intellectually honest and justified.
Well,
In that
wait.
it is,
No,
it's a
no.
concept, or
That's
it's a
not true.
principle of logic.
Let's go back to the year 100, okay? And you and I are sitting around trying to explain gravity. I tell you, Occam's razor ain't going to give us the answer.
You're right, but neither is making it up. That's my point.
No, that's true. That's true.
Occam's
But
razor applies only when you have the incomplete information of saying, well, what are the possible conclusions? And who knows? I mean, the best conclusion that we can make is that things go down because of something.
right.
That's sort of the simplest. There is something that causes it. But you're right, we don't know it. But that doesn't mean that we should therefore say
How
it's
much is it
fairies
that we
that
don't?
swat it to the ground.
Yeah. How much do you're right? How much do we know now? We don't know what it is we don't know yet, and we have no clue how much it is we don't know. So, my point here is just that Occam's razor is the wisest response, but even as explained by the people who use it, it is never really asserted that it'll end up always being right. It's just that the number of times you're going to be right is better. You get better odds, and it's kind of
See,
like,
I go beyond that though, because you're
yeah, I know
taking
you
it
do.
almost from a Bayesian statistics principle. I mean, that's
Sure,
actually
sure.
that's Bayes was the one the mathematician that sort of upended Karl Popper's falsification principle in saying that no, because falsification still leaves us with a potentially infinite amount of options that have not yet been falsified. We need to be able to draw conclusions, and that is the best way to do that is to use
Sure.
this statistical model, which has been named after him, Bayesian statistics. So
Yeah.
that I agree that Occam's razor, in some cases, draws us in that direction, but in other cases, we have so little information, such as what happens after death, that the best conclusions are the ones that are
Yeah,
either
I'd say we have
non-conclusive.
such little information that I think that Occam's razor is out. To be
Well,
honest with you. Yeah.
Occam's razor then says, the answer that makes up the least is the answer that should be accepted. So perhaps in that situation, the one
Uh,
that draws the
sure.
fewest conclusions is just I don't know, which is the same for the origin of the universe or whatever caused the Big Bang, things of that nature. I still
I'll
have
tell you
to
what,
say that.
I find myself hesitating to submit to any rule that tells me how to think. It just strikes me as being I don't know, uh, unwise. I think that there's a certain healthy amount of, like, that's part of the skepticism. Oh yeah, I think it's unwise to just willy nilly run in the direction of a far more complex. But with Occam's razor, I think let's at least have a sketch, you know, something to go by, something that at least reasonably suggests something. When it comes to death, all we have are anecdotes. That's it, and people who had near death experiences, and we have no clue if that is even close to what death is like. We don't know. So we're out of our element here
But,
in a
and
real way.
I'm still going with the
Yeah.
it is unjustified for us to draw any conclusions that anything does happen after death. And to the best of our ex,
Unjustified, I would
right,
say,
I mean
is
it's also unjustified to draw a absolute or a conclusion that nothing happens after death. You're right that the atheism is a null
wait a
hypothesis in
minute.
that.
Let's discuss the difference between what we can agree on between ourselves and what's justified. Um, I don't believe that anybody has anything less than a sovereign right to make sense of things in a way that makes sense to them. But if they want to compel someone else, that's when we're going to have to abide by a few rules. So I do see a difference between the standard
But
needed
define
for
compel
personal
somebody else.
perspective.
Do you mean just to compel them to believe with them or to act upon those things in a way that can affect it? Because you yourself brought up
Right?
how
Both.
harmful it can be to choose to trust in God instead of choosing to do something for yourself. So these beliefs have consequences, even
They
if they're
sure
not
do. Right.
directly
Right.
being compelled or trying to compel other people to do them.
Right. And unfortunately, when it comes to questions of death, there's a great deal of potential harm that can come from either conclusion, and which ought to humble us to realize, wow, this is sticky stuff. But when I say compel, I mean, for example, if you were a mathematician and I'm a mathematician, and I want to show you that a certain that doing something with a straight edge and a ruler can bisect an angle, and I can show you the math and do the proof. And once you see the math, I can compel you to believe this by having you see how this is just inarguably so, and that compels you, in that sense. Um, so it's one thing for you know. So there are some things we can compel upon others that when there is a agreed upon methodology that can exist between us, we can then require of somebody else a certain level of agreement. When there is not that sort of thing, we can't require of anybody to just say, sorry, if you can't stick to these interpersonal rules, you can't even do this on your own. I just don't see where
But
that
there's a difference between saying that something is unjustified and then saying you can't do it. I'm saying it's unjustified according to the rules of logic and reason, and that's. I mean, I can certainly recognize that you have the right to be illogical or to be irrational, but that doesn't mean that you're not being
Well,
illogical or irrational.
haven't we already agreed, even like Dr. Shook, that logic is something we human beings have worked out based upon what seems to be working for us, limited to our senses and our experience. Where do we assume that we as human beings really possess an insight into all of reality, or an insight into? I mean, we see the three dimensions plus time that we live in. What if there's really a sense of logic that totally violates what makes sense to us coherently? That's all a part of a multidimensional reality that string theorists have every good reason to believe is likely, particularly as they're looking for their universal theory of energy. So there's a sense in which I certainly can't compel anybody to go along with this, but to forbid me to think that it's so unjustified that I even really ought not to do it, or to say that if I'm doing so, I'm believing in something that's illogical or irrational. I'm believing in
I
something
think
that
though
logic or rationale can't deal with. That doesn't make it irrational. It
But
just
that,
makes
Bob,
it
is you and I have disagreed
different.
on trying to
Yeah.
define the term faith, and I think that is sort of the best general description of what faith is when we talk about religious faith. Is that there's things that do fall outside of the scope of the rational and the logical, and sometimes those things are simply outside of the scope but they're in a different scope, like the emotional, or the experiential. But there's also things that can be examined or studied by the emotional by the rational, the logical sides of us, and then it is when we choose to step away from that, if we willfully recognize that we are stepping outside of that framework for to draw conclusions on things that cannot be drawn from that, but are also not related to the other aspects, that is where we get faith. That is what I think the term faith really sort of speaks to and of in the general psyche is faith is when we sort of draw these conclusions based on things that we don't yet know. We call it wishful thinking, call it, your sort of interpolation of all of the experiences and things that you've done. But I see the willful rejection or refusal to adhere to the rules of logic and reason.
Oh no, I would not say we should reject logic. I'm just saying we should realize that logic has its limits, and beyond that, I don't know what the rules are that apply. I don't know what they are, and therefore I can't speak with force concerning them. Now, there's a sense here in which back before Christianity hit Europe, they had a kind of a polytheistic view that involved the Roman gods and Greek gods and the fates, and there was not necessarily at that time, before monotheism came to Europe, there was not really a sense that faith in a single god was ever going to guarantee you anything, because there's other gods that could mess all this up for you. So,
but faith in a god, you're I think taking an extra step in saying that it guarantees you something. I'm saying faith in a god itself, the belief in gods is what is sort of defined as faith, because these are things that cannot be concluded by, and admittedly at that point the laws of reason and logic were not quite as well nuanced as they are now. But when you willfully step outside of those to draw conclusions is when you are exercising faith, regardless of if you're doing so with specific hopes or not.
Well, there either is or is not, right?
Right.
Those are the only options when it comes to a God who could create the heavens and the earth. There either is or isn't, and there's a sense in which I think that if we're going to be really honest and uncomfortably honest, we're at that point where we're going, well, I don't know. How can I know? How can I ever know? And but since it is something, I don't have a problem with a person taking a risk that it's one way or the other. I have no problem with your being an atheist. None.
Well,
And I don't think
that's the thing, though.
I
Is I
can't
think
picture a
that
God having a problem with your being an atheist. I can't picture that. How could he have a problem with your coming to that conclusion when there's absolutely no good reason you can come up with that's an honestly good reason for you to change that?
yeah, I have to agree that you're
Yep.
right. I
Yeah.
would conclude as well that any God that would hold that against me is a God that I wouldn't worship. So,
Yeah.
there's a sort
I
of
wouldn't.
that little atheist gambit there, I guess. But
Yeah.
that's where
You
many
got nothing to
people would say
lose, I'm
that it
pretty
takes
sure.
just as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a believer, and
I
that's
don't
where
know.
I
I
think
have
that
no
term
idea.
faith
You know
really
what?
becomes
Yeah.
nuanced, is what you were just talking about. Is we
Yeah.
both need to sort of admittedly just throw our arms up in the air and say, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the most honest answer anybody can come up with this.
Right.
But then to say, I don't know, but here's the feeling that I get. This is what I believe.
Right.
And I think that not taking the null hypothesis in that by then, coming up with a greater belief than null is what is best defined as faith. I think we even
Okay.
discussed that when we were trying to
Well,
operationally define it as
I
a
know. Well, you know
deviation
what?
from the null hypothesis.
If that's what really makes sense to you, I would highly recommend that that's what you do.
All right. Well, we do have a couple viewer
Yeah.
comments. I want to get. They're talking more about
And
death.
if God has a problem with that, you tell him to talk to me.
I'll do that. I can't I just talk to you? I thought that was in when
Well, you could.
go back
I
to the
suppose
revival.
We'll both go talk to him.
Yeah, can
Oh,
you do that with your mixer
I'll
quick?
intercede on your
Put on your
behalf.
God voice for the remainder of the show.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, you got a
so
couple
viewer
there?
comments here. First of all, we have Robin said Bob has such insight. It's amazing. So that little bit to you. From there, she said how wrong and silly you. No, uh, she made a powerful point here though in saying people who say God got them through something need to realize that it's their own strength. People are stronger than they think, with no supernatural stuff needed.
Yes. How they've robbed themselves of the credit of a lesson learned. My goodness. Yeah.
We also have another commenter, Lucius, I think, spelled with a T, but that's the only way I can come up with to pronounce that. So, this is discussing your butterfly analogy specifically, saying, so a child that dies in agony from leukemia is the same as a struggling butterfly? You want to take a moment to respond to that?
I have no idea. I don't know what comes after death. But you know, it seems to me that that whatever comes after death is in some ways immaterial, and that entering into that, it's hard to say. I would not. I would not want to sit next to a suffering child and say, oh, quit your bellyache, and everything's gonna be wonderful in just a moment. That's
But people do that
deeply
all the time. I
insensitive.
mean, we need to recognize that, that's people feed them this, and it gives them comfort. You're going to heaven.
If it
It's
can.
going to be a great, blissful place. So that is certainly done quite a bit.
Although I'll tell you what, it is amazing though. There's some people who've gone through some immense suffering like that, who end up actually surviving, and their testimony about that suffering is nowhere near as horrible as we who watch them go through it imagined it would be. There's some people who have talked about how there was almost a peace in it they couldn't describe.
I
There's a
understand that.
resignation. There's a resignation. I have no idea what the spiritual implications of that are, and I wouldn't want to begin to even pontificate, but to say that that is a horribly wonderful question, and it is the kind of thing where how can we not have empathy and care for people we see going through that kind of suffering? It is immense. But what does that lead to? Uh, I don't know, but I certainly don't know that it is meaningless or
Well,
useless.
but I mean, that's I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah,
The viewer did give an additional comment that's a response to that, but I wanted to give my own first here a little bit,
sure,
and that is that I think first of all, when we say that the people who come through that don't have the same description of as we expect them to, we have incredibly adaptive selective memories that
don't we?
forget pain really well. And remember positives and anything that we can is adhered. I mean, that's the confirmation bias is very strongly associated with that, and certainly think that it is a very adaptive trait to human survivability is to be able
Sure.
to forget about the bad stuff or diminish it in our memory to the greatest extent possible. My brother's wife
So
gave
maybe
birth
that's its purpose.
Wednesday night. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. It is my brother's second daughter and her fourth child. She's awesome. Her name's Cameron, my new niece, and I know that she went through this birth without having any drugs, and this is the first time that she's done that, and it was a very painful experience for her. But
Oh,
anytime you talk with a mother after the fact, instead of during the fact, the memory that they're going to give you, yes, they'll say it was very painful. They remember that it was very painful, but they don't really remember the pain as specifically.
yeah.
You know, they can't re-experience that pain. They can't. You can re-experience joy in remembering things,
Yeah.
but pain is
I,
something that our bodies sort of adaptively shut out.
do we know the kinds of hormones that are released in that pain and what they do to then engage the body in that process of birth and the process of the body rehabilitating after birth? I'm not so sure we understand all those roles in that. But not every woman goes through that, which is amazing. I have a sister-in-law who basically, stops in at the hospital on her way to the grocery store to have a baby, basically.
Yes, I've heard of those
and,
ones. That
and she, I think one time she went in there, she had one of the children. She was like in there for 3 or 4 hours or something. I can't remember what it was. Lisa can remember perhaps.
like I'm just gonna walk
And
home.
she goes home that day. She's done. Okay, we got the baby. What the hell are we hanging around here for? And just not the experience I've seen with other women, and I would never dare say to any other woman, why can't you do that?
I will. I'm going to go on record and saying all women should do that. It's your fault for not doing that. This is God
Yeah,
punishing you for eating the apple or something. Um,
yeah.
there's also we have a new comment
By the way,
here.
before you
Yep.
do that, just before you say, I think there's also an abusive thing in trying to hush people from raising these questions of this kind of suffering. That I think could also be abusive. If I can resolve it by perceiving the possibility that there is meaning in it, even if I don't know what that meaning is, I think that's good enough for me. If I can suggest that to somebody and it's helpful to them, I think that's wonderful. But to really try to push that on somebody who's not ready for it or open to it or whatever, to me that's just abuse.
And you're right. This is why I don't pursue people down this path when they're in
Yeah.
states of weakness. I don't ever pursue somebody to challenge their faith. If they don't
Right.
want to talk about it, they don't want to talk about it. I think that's one thing that is a special
There
a
are no
special
experts when it
respect
comes
for
to death.
people's belief.
Yeah.
That we need to understand that we don't need to respect their beliefs per se, but we do need to respect their humanity and not treat them in any sort of way where we would try to bully their beliefs out of them or take advantage of states of weakness or do anything. Even that's I think it's even predatory when religious people
Yeah.
do this all the time.
Right. Oh,
I
definitely.
brought
I
up
agree with you. Yeah.
Mother Teresa in the last show with Joey about how her ministry was a hospice that embraced suffering in a way that they did not give much for pain medication, and it was in many ways to help her preach the gospel, and in
Perhaps. Yeah.
in a mission. It was not just a mission of helping to ease these pain, but it was also a mission just to preach the gospel. And I think that is a fundamentally sick part of religion that does that. There's not every religion and not every religious person, and in not every situation Just the blanket qualifications there. But there are far too many times when religious people and religious organizations and hierarchies encourage that kind of behavior, the predatory preying on people's weakness to try to get them to accept this doctrine.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very bad thing. There's a couple more viewer comments, though. One was directed at me here, specifically about my, well, first, a viewer comment on that note, it was a great quote here. It says, attacking someone's faith without their permission is like snatching away a child's security blanket. I would argue that the permission is kind of the thing that's there. I don't necessarily need somebody's permission, but it would be more against their will if they are trying to actively avoid what you're doing. Then you are.
I would think it's also, we can hold people responsible for the choices they make without having to necessarily argue with them about how it is they make sense of those choices. We can do that.
But the comment that was directed at me specifically, it says it depends on the kind of pain that you're talking about. This is when I was referring to women not remembering the pain of childbirth. But they said you can re-experience emotional pain in the same way that you can re-experience joy. You're comparing emotional joy to physical pain, and you're right. I did not consider that. As a matter of fact, I have a document here that I had put together for when Joey and I were doing Clash Course in the last hour that talks about pain and suffering. And it's just a series of quotes that it's not loading for me right now because the computer's slow as molasses. But one of those is that pain is the experience, and that suffering is our reaction to that experience, or something. Pain is the feeling. Suffering is the effect the pain inflicts. If one can endure pain, one can live without suffering. If one can withstand pain, one can withstand anything. If one learns to control pain, one can learn to control oneself. Is the
very Buddhist, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in it. Definitely. I mean, think about it. How many human beings have died that we're aware of? It's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of some 6-7 billion, right? Can we learn anything from this? One thing we learned from it is apparently we're all going to die. We're all going to suffer. It is the way of life, and I do think that it isn't a pleasant reality to face and accept, nor do I think we need to kind of marinate in it and live in the depression of the reality of it. But I think we do need to come to terms with it. And once we come to terms with it, we do not suffer as much.
That might be worth talking about next week. There's a great article that I found a few months back that I'd love to discuss more about the coping mechanisms of sort of existential dilemmas. But before we go into that, I mean, we brought up death again here, and there's a couple more comments from a viewer, Lucius, who told me that I did pronounce it correctly, so thank you for that. But it says that this is in regards to the belief in some sort of existence beyond death, and it says it's sort of a multi one, so I'm going to have to switch and read each one. But you can't assert that learning goes on if you don't know what comes after death. Sort of the same argument that I was making about.
I certainly can't assert it.
But then this is the part that's this is a longer one. It's split into two posts here, but it says this is about the effects on the brain, or how the personality, the mind, is related to the brain. That is evidence that once the brain stops working, then you, as you know yourself, I mean, your thoughts, your mind ceases to exist. And we know that damaging the brain partially causes damage to thinking ability and personality. Damaging the whole brain by death should conclude that it destroys both. That it's.
I would disagree with that. We certainly know this, that while we live in our bodies, we are constrained by them, but we don't know what that constraint actually is. I mean, it's possible that the reason our IQs are what they are is because of the brain we happen to be inhabiting. But once loosened from this brain and this body, if there is a spirit and a self that survives immaterially, there might be no constraints, and we all have an IQ of 750. Um,
But the we and the I, I think is obviously a function of the brain because we can destroy parts of the brain and have the person still be alive, but have those aspects not
what does that
exist
prove? What does that
anymore.
prove? When you destroy the interface, you don't know what's on the other side of the interface if you've destroyed it.
Not sure what you mean.
Well, if you smash the monitor on your computer, this doesn't mean that there aren't video functions going on inside of it. It's just not displaying, because you smashed it. Um, we do not know that people who've suffered brain damage are having any difficulty other than interfacing with the realities. We don't know that who and what they are inside. In fact, we've discovered sometimes in getting to know some autistic people and giving them new ways of communicating that there's a whole lot more going on that's far more coherent than we had thought. So I would say that if we're in a body that is constrained, then if that body experiences damage, then we're even more constrained. But that doesn't mean that that this is all there is to us. It just doesn't mean that.
Well, we might have
I
to
mean,
come back
that's
to that next week. I
yeah.
think that's a topic worthy of more discussion. There's the viewer replied to that in saying that, but if you smash the whole computer, we're fairly certain that it's no longer functioning.
That's because it's
Or
a
there's no
material
functions
reality,
going on.
right?
Well, and
It-
that's the argument being made is that there's no reason for us to believe that there's more than a material reality with relation to the mind. That is a
probably no
compelling
reason,
reason.
not probably no reason to compel it, right? I would agree with
Right.
that.
Once again,
Yes,
coming from the deviation from the null hypothesis, it takes faith, defined
it
as a
does.
deviation from the null hypothesis, to go from
Such faith as I have, yes.
right. And on that, I'd love to explore that topic maybe a bit more next week. The other one that I'd
Fine. Yeah,
wanted to bring to the table is the understanding of love that you brought up a few weeks back, saying that love was a valuation, not an emotion. And
right.
I did not understand that, and I just like to explore what you have to say about
Sure.
that more.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's it for the show. We're actually a couple minutes over time because that's what I do. Uh, and stick around after this for Bob to stay on, the Unconventional Pastor, and join us again for the Cult of Honesty Wednesday night, or the Unconventional Pastor for his next viewing right before that, and then for Inspiring Honesty again next week right after Clash Course. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.